New York City in the 19th century, a place of staggering contrast, wealth and poverty, elegance and squalor, law and chaos. It is in the shadows of this modern metropolis that a gritty underworld of street gangs rose. But these gangs were more than mere ruffians. They became almost folk legends of the city's slums, ruling the back alleys and tenements when the night fell, and sometimes even in the broad daylight. So today, we're going to look at the rise of New York's street gangs, from their humble beginnings in those notorious neighborhoods like 5 Points, the violent clashes, the interesting characters, and their evolution by the century's end. So get ready to hear about ferocious gang riots that turned New York streets into battlefields, and interesting characters like Hellcat Maggie, who allegedly filed her teeth down and wore claw-like brass fingernails, and even a time when desperate citizens mounted a cannon on a dock to ward off a boatload of gangsters returning from a drunken outing. All interesting stuff. It's all real history. So I hope you'll enjoy our time together today. Now let me welcome you to the channel. If you are new here, it's great to have you on board, and I invite you to click that subscribe button. You'll get plenty more of this kind of content, and, well, the playlists are, of course, full of the same sort of thing. And this video, along with all the other videos on the channel, is ad-free. You enjoy it completely uninterrupted. That's a pretty good deal, isn't it? Well, this is due to the Patreon contributions and the YouTube memberships, those who checked out the merch store, and the occasional donation. Thank you very much for that. Okay, now with all of that out of the way, let's begin our video for today. A bit of history of New York. How interesting. Of course, we begin in the early 1800s, and at this time, New York's most notorious slum was an area known as 5 Points, located in Lower Manhattan. It was called this because 5 streets converged there in what had once been a pond, but was filled in and built over with ramshackle buildings, proper slum dwellings, And by the 1820s, 5 Points had deteriorated into a densely crowded, crime-ridden neighborhood filled with tenement houses and makeshift saloons. Poor immigrants, especially the Irish and free black Americans, made their homes there in desperate conditions. It was the breeding ground for what many consider the first organized street gang in New York, known as the 40 Thieves. The 40 Thieves gang was reportedly formed around the mid-1820s in a 5 Points grocery store that doubled as a cheap gin dive. Gin, of course, being the drink of choice for the lower classes of the time. A woman named Rosanna Pierce was running that establishment, selling vegetables out front and strong liquor in a back room. And that back room became the hangout for local thieves and thugs who organized themselves for mutual protection and mutual profit. By around 1825, these gang members coalesced into a more organized structure. New York's first named gang, the 40 Thieves, almost all of them Irish immigrants, or the children of Irish immigrants. Contemporary observers were quick to notice the mayhem they caused. In fact, as early as 1829, a Vermont newspaper warned that, quote, outrages of one kind or other are daily and nightly committed at 5 Points, principally by a gang called the 40 Thieves. The paper noted that the orderly portion of the citizens were even contemplating a vigilante revolution to reclaim the neighborhood from these criminals. This report, coming from far-off New England, by the way, shows how infamous the 5 Points gang were becoming, even in their own time. Under the leadership of an Irish tough guy named Edward Coleman, the 40 Thieves gained a reputation for pickpocketing, robberies, and just general lawlessness in the 5 Points. They weren't literally 40 in number, by the way. Likely the gang was quite larger. The 40 Thieves was more of a tongue-in-cheek moniker. But they did operate with a semblance of organization. Later accounts claim Coleman imposed a quota system. Each member had to bring back a certain amount of stolen goods or money regularly, or else they would get kicked out of the gang. No pressure, right? Well, they also reportedly franchised the gang, if you can use those sorts of terminology, by recruiting younger delinquent boys into a feeder group known as the 40 Little Thieves. These were essentially child pickpockets and lookouts, street urchins trained to steal and to alert the gang if police were nearby. It was a bit Dickensian, I suppose. A scene right out of Great Expectations playing out in New York. Ragged young boys deployed like Oliver Twist through the crowded streets to dip into purses and pockets. But it is important to note that some of the 40 Thieves legends comes from the later retellings. For instance, Herbert Asbury's book in 1928, The Gangs of New York, yes, the one that the film is based on, it kind of romanticized the gang's exploits. And modern historians have since gone back to check up on the facts. We know from legal records that Edward Coleman himself had a gruesome fate. In 1838, he murdered his own wife in a drunken rage, a shocking crime that led to his execution by hanging in 1839. And in fact, Coleman became the first man ever hanged at the notorious Tombs prison in New York. Not the kind of legacy he wanted, I assume. Well, at the trial, and in press coverage, however, Coleman was not explicitly identified as a gang leader at the time. Some historians do suggest the idea that he was the chieftain of the 40 Thieves, and that this idea might have been exaggerated in later lore. Sure, he was probably involved to some extent, but perhaps we will never really know to what extent that was. But what we do know is that Coleman's crime and punishment were well known, and they fed into the 5 Points' fearful reputation. Despite Coleman's removal, the 40 Thieves gang did not vanish overnight. They persisted into the 1830s and beyond, though as 5 Points grew and changed, the original crew eventually splintered into other gangs or faded away. The 5 Points remained a hive of criminal activity, though. That was one thing that did not change. Another early gang called the Kerryonians, comprised of Irish immigrants from County Kerry, also operated out of Rosanna Pierre's gin shop in those years. The Kerryonians were said to be less of a formal gang and more of a rowdy club of Irishmen, united by county loyalty and by a special hatred for the English. And this shows a crucial point. New York's first gangs often formed along ethnic lines, especially among new immigrants who banded together in rough neighborhoods for protection and camaraderie. 5 Points, with its heavy Irish population living in dire poverty, was the perfect incubator for these defensive criminal societies. At least they saw it as defensive. So by the 1830s, we can see that street gangs were already well and truly part of New York's landscape, even if they weren't yet called gangs in a modern sense. But they were neighborhood-based groups of young, disenfranchised toughs, usually from the same ethnic background, engaging in petty crime and turf rivalries. The city's authorities were ill-equipped to deal with them at first. In those early decades of the 19th century, New York didn't have a professional police force. In fact, the NYPD would only be established in 1845. Policing was done by small bands of watchmen and constables, often quite ineffective in the slums, way too outnumbered. so it was little wonder that the 5 Points gang acted with impunity. They were, in effect, the unofficial rulers of the slum, a fact that later gave rise to a kind of dark romanticism about them. Writers and residents would speak of 5 Points as if it were an exotic no-go zone in the heart of the city, ruled by gangs in a world apart from the genteel streets uptown. As New York City continued to grow through the 40s and 50s, its population swelled with immigrants, especially the Irish, fleeing famine after 1845. The influx of destitute Irish Catholics stirred more than a bit of resentment among some native-born, or at least the longer-established New Yorkers, many of whom were Protestant and of English or Dutch descent. Out of those tensions arose a new, fiercer generation of gangs. The gang landscape began to reflect the social and political divides of the city. On one side were the predominantly Irish gangs at the 5 Points and the poor districts, and on the other side were the gangs of American-born, anti-immigrant nativists who viewed the Irish newcomers with hostility. Their clashes would help define New York's gang history in the mid-19th century, and the most famous rivalry was between the Irish toughs of 5 Points, often collectively nicknamed the Dead Rabbits, and a nativist gang called the Bowery Boys. Now, the Bowery Boys were a gang based in the Bowery, that is a street and a neighborhood not far from 5 Points, but socioeconomically quite different. The Bowery in the mid-1800s was a working-class area, home to many native-born white artisans, laborers, and small businessmen. Many Bowery Boys were volunteer firemen, a respected civic role at the time. They tended to dress and carry themselves with pride, and indeed the Bowery Boys had a distinctive uniform. They wore red flannel shirts, the kind of ones that the firefighters wore, dark trousers tucked into boots, and tall stovepipe hats. Often a bit battered from the brawling, but meant to display their status as native New Yorkers. A contemporary in the 1870s described a typical Bowery sighting. You might see him strutting along, like a king in his breeches struck in his boots, his coat on his arm, his flaming red shirt tied at the collar with a cravat, as such could be seen nowhere else. None so ready as he for a fight, none so quick to resent the intrusion of a respectable man into his haunts. Well, that description was written by James D. McCabe, and you can certainly have an image of your head of the swaggering, combative style of the Bowery Boys. But this gang was tightly intertwined with the area's nativist political movement, the Know Nothing Party, and related organizations that opposed immigrant influence. They saw themselves as true Americans, defending their city from foreign elements, especially Irish Catholic ones. On the other side, the 5 Points Irish had their own gangs. We mentioned the Dead Rabbits. That was commonly the term used for the Irish street fighters of the 5 Points in the 1850s. The origin of that curious name remains a little bit mysterious. According to one popular story, the Roach Guards, an Irish gang named after a local liquor dealer called Roach, split into factions, and during a particularly heated meeting, someone flung a dead rabbit carcass onto the meeting room floor, whereupon one faction proudly seized the name Dead Rabbits for themselves. Sounds plausible. There is another explanation, too. That dead rabbit was street slang of the time, some saying it came from Irish Gaelic for rowdy youth or thug, essentially meaning a tough guy that you better watch out for. In any case, whatever its origin, New York newspapers picked up the term and ran with it. By the mid-1850s, any Irish street gang from 5 Points might be labeled Dead Rabbits in the process. and the gang members themselves reportedly carried a dead rabbit on a pike as a kind of grotesque mascot during street fights. The Dead Rabbits versus the Bowery Boys became the great gang rivalry of New York legend. They clashed repeatedly in street brawls during the 1840s and 50s, often on the borders of their territories. It was common, for instance, for fights to break out when volunteer fire companies staffed by the Bowery Boys responded to a fire in or near 5 Points, only to be met by hostile Irish crowds. Each side championed different political causes too. The Bowery Boys tended to support the Nativist and later Republican causes, whereas the Irish gang members were aligned with Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that courted immigrant voters. Gangs would sometimes be mobilized to influence elections, and by influence we mean intimidating voters at polling places or rallying neighboring turnout. Politics and crime, they mixed freely. Not like modern days, I'm sure. Aside from that, a gang leader might also be a ward political organizer. In 5 Points, a Tammany-linked figure named John Smoke Morrissey became a name for himself in both arenas. He was an Irish-born former gang member and bare-knuckle prize fighter who eventually won a seat in Congress and helped run a gambling empire. That's pretty broad business scope, isn't it? But before his ascent to somewhat respectability, Morrissey was involved in one of the era's most notorious incidents, the feud with William Poole, also known as Bill the Butcher, the leader of the Bowery Boys. Bill the Butcher epitomized the Bowery nativist tough. He was literally a butcher by trade, running a butcher shop, and a fearsome pugilist. It's an old word for a boxer, by the way. Poole and John Morrissey were arch rivals. Their enmity symbolized the clash between native and Irish factions. In February of 1855, this rivalry turned fatal. After a long simmering conflict and a barroom confrontation, Poole was shot by associates of Morrissey at Stanwix Hall, a saloon on Broadway. The murder of Bill the Butcher became huge news in the city. Poole did not die immediately. Incredibly, he had a bullet lodged near his heart, and he lingered for nearly 2 weeks, cursing his enemies and swearing patriotism. According to legend, as Poole lay dying, he finally gasped out the words, "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." Well, this declaration was emblazoned on the banners at his funeral, and thousands turned out to mourn him as a fallen hero of the nativist cause. In the eyes of his supporters, Poole was kind of a martyr, slain by immigrant thugs. But to the Irish of 5 Points, Poole's death was a measure of revenge, and even a warning to those who wanted to bully their community. Of course, that was not the end of it. The whole episode only intensified the hatred between the Bowery Boys and the Irish gangs. But of course, this was not even the crescendo. That would come on July 4th and 5th of 1857, when New York witnessed one of the worst street battles in history, a melee remembered as the Dead Rabbits Riot. What began as a small skirmish between the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys on Independence Day escalated into a full-scale urban riot that raged for 48 hours. It was a sign of how powerful and brazen the gangs had become, and how the forces of law and order struggled to contain them. The spark of the riot was an attempted raid. On the evening of July 4th, a mob of 5 Points gang members, mostly Dead Rabbits and their allies, marched into the Bowery determined to attack a Bowery Boys clubhouse or headquarters. They were met with the Bowery met in the Bowery by a gathering of Bowery Boys and allied Nativist gang members, and a vicious fight erupted on Bayard Street. The combatants wielded clubs, paving stones, knives, and even a few pistols. At first, the Bowery Boys managed to repel the 5 Points gang, driving them back toward the 5 Points area, Paradise Square. But the battle was only just getting started. By the next morning, July 5th, gangs from all over the city had converged and joined in. Reinforced dead rabbits returned to the fray, and the fighting spread through the warren of the narrow streets around 5 Points. Baxter, Marbury, Worth, and Bayard Streets became a war zone. Contemporary newspapers painted a startling picture of all the chaos. One reporter wrote that, quote, brickbats, stones, and clubs were flying thickly around, and that wounded men lay on the sidewalks getting trampled underfoot as the mob surged back and forth. The battle lines seesawed. A charge by the dead rabbits would push the Bowery Boys up the street. Then the Bowery side, bolstered by new fighters, would rally and drive the rabbits back into the maze of the 5 Points. Residents barricaded their tenement doors and windows in terror. Gawkers came out to watch, only to flee when stray bullets or stones whizzed by. And importantly, in 1857, New York had a divided police force which hampered the initial response. There was a political struggle at the time between the city-controlled municipal police loyal to the mayor and a newly formed state-controlled metropolitan police. The schism led to confusion over jurisdiction and a lack of immediate action. The gangs took full advantage of that disarray. Eventually, some metropolitan police did attempt to intervene, but the first small squad that arrived was overwhelmed. When a handful of officers charged into the fight, the mob turned on them. Famously, one lone patrolman was beaten to the ground. They even took his badge and club, and then they stripped most of his clothes off. He was left there nearly naked, trying to arrest a gang leader. Well, the officer barely escaped with his life to report the riot. By late morning of July 5th, the situation was so out of control that a larger contingent of police, about 150 officers, was mobilized under the direction of Police Commissioner George Matzel and Captain Isaiah Rinders. They marched into the combat zone in force. Even then, the gangs did not immediately disperse. Many gang members had taken to the rooftops of the tenements, from which they hurled bricks and debris down on the police lines. Others constructed makeshift barricades out of carts and lumber in the street, firing muskets and pistols from behind those defenses. In effect, parts of the Lower East Side turned into an impromptu fortress held by the gangs. It took the ultimate show of force to finally quell the riot. Eventually, the authorities called in the state militia. By evening, regiments of the National Guard, including the 71st and 8th Regiments, marched down the streets with fixed bayonets, accompanied by 2 large squads of police. Faced with soldiers and a wall of armed authority, the gang combatants seemed to have lost their nerve and scattered. Order was gradually restored as the uniformed militiamen clattered through the alleys, clubbing any stragglers and tearing down barricades. Over the 2 days of mayhem, at least 8 people were killed. Some reports say a dozen, and dozens more were seriously wounded. Countless others likely suffered injuries that went unreported, and rumors swirled that both gangs quietly removed some of their dead to bury them in cellars and back lots, hiding the true toll. The Dead Rabbits Riot of 1857 was a shocking event for New Yorkers, but it was also a kind of incident that fed the gang lore of the city. Newspapers gave lurid accounts, and the names Dead Rabbits and Bowery Boys became famous well beyond the city. Here's something interesting too. In the aftermath, leaders of the Dead Rabbits were sensitive about their image. They didn't want to be branded as mere criminals. They were a bit more classy than that, at least in their own minds. A group purporting to represent the Dead Rabbits even paid to publish a letter in the New York Times denying that they were thieves or that they were the ones who instigated the riot. A little bit of public relations work. You see, they claimed that the fight had actually been between two other gangs, the Roach Guards and the Bowery's Atlantic Guards, and insisted that the Dead Rabbits, quote, wouldn't allow a thief to live on their beat, much less be a member of their club. Well, this attempt at public relations, as absurd as it seems, certainly shows these gangs had a kind of pride and a code of honor, at least in their own minds. They wanted to be seen as fighters with a cause, not mere looters and lowbrow criminals. By the late 1850s, the city government and the police had finally begun cracking down in gangs in a more organized way. The very year of the riot, 1857, the police forces were consolidated after a bizarre episode known as the Police Riot, in which the two rival police forces had literally brawled with each other outside City Hall, but that's a topic for another video, I suppose. But with a unified metropolitan police and more political will to subdue lawlessness, the authorities started to make a little bit of headway. Some gang leaders were jailed or driven out of the city. Also, the city itself was changing. Slums like 5 Points underwent gradual clearance and reform efforts. But of course, these improvements were slow and quite uneven. Well, even as the infamous Dead Rabbits riot receded, New York City's violence did not cease. In fact, the greatest urban riot in American history was still to come. In July of 1863, amid the Civil War, New York was convulsed by the Draft Riots, a 4-day uprising against the Union Army's conscription that turned into a race riot and even a class war. While the Draft Riots were not a gang-organized event per se, they involved thousands of ordinary citizens, many of them Irish laborers infuriated by the draft law. The chaos provided plenty of opportunity for gang elements to loot and settle scores. Many of the same impoverished neighborhoods that had birthed the gangs exploded in fury. Mobs attacked draft officers, wealthy homes, and especially black residents of the city, who were scapegoated by the mostly white rioters at the time. It's known that criminal gangs joined in the mayhem, using the riot to rob stores and exact revenge on targets, like the homes of rich Republicans or abolitionists. The police were just too overwhelmed. Only the arrival of the battle-hardened Union Army regiments from the Gettysburg battlefield finally crushed the draft riots. But by then, perhaps 120 people were dead, and whole city blocks had been burned. The draft riots showed that New York's urban underclass, the same pool of people from which the gangs emerged, could be a fearsome force when pushed to extremes. After 1873, there was a more determined effort by city elites and the press to never let such lawlessness reoccur. Policing was strengthened further, and some social reforms were implemented. Yet even after the Civil War, gangs did not disappear. They adapted to the new realities and, if anything, became more structured and multifaceted in their criminal activity. In the decades after the Civil War, that is the 1870s and 80s, often called the Gilded Age, New York City saw continued immigration, now increasingly from Southern and Eastern Europe as well. rapid economic change, and, of course, persistent poverty in many districts. Just because the country was getting richer doesn't usually mean the people do. Funny how that works, isn't it? Well, street gangs evolved out of this as well. The mid-century Irish versus Nativist rivalry subsided somewhat as the Irish became more established and other groups arrived. But new gangs arose from the ashes of the old. Perhaps the most powerful and notorious New York gang of the post-war era was the Whyos. The Whyos gang, active roughly from the late 1860s to the 80s, took its name from the curious bird call whistle, Y-O-Y-O. The members would use to signal, excuse me. Now, the Whyos were mainly based in 5 Points in the lower Manhattan area, inheriting the turf once dominated by the Dead Rabbits and the other Irish gangs. By this time, the nature of gang activity in general was seeing a little bit of a shift. The Whyos engaged in the classic crimes of their predecessors, street brawling, theft, assault, but they were also getting involved in more organized rackets, like extortion, counterfeiting, prostitution, these kinds of things. New York was becoming a more modern city, and gangs were becoming more like proto-organized crime groups, diversifying their income streams. But that's not to say that the Whyos lacked the old gang flair for violence. They were tough customers, that's for sure. While many colorful and frightening characters walked within the Whyos ranks. For example, Dandy John Dolan, who was a Whyo known for carrying a custom-made copper tool, specifically for gouging out enemies' eyes. Sounds friendly. And he reportedly wore boots outfitted with sharp axe blades in the soles, so he could literally kick someone to death. Another infamous member, Biker Ryan, became legendary for carrying a price list of violent services he would perform for hire. This macabre menu of crimes for sale included prices like $2 for a punch in the nose, $15 for chewing someone's ear off, $19 for breaking a leg or arm, or even up to $100 for, quote, doing the big job. And we know that that is not a wash and vacuum. We all know what doing the big job means. Well, whether or not this list was ever actually printed, or just underworld lore, certainly shows the notoriety of the Whyos as professional thugs who could be brought to intimidate, maim, or kill. The Whyos reached the peak of their power around the early 1880s. They essentially controlled the streets of lower Manhattan at night. Many members opened their own saloons, dance halls, or disorderly houses as fronts for illicit activities. They would also extort local shopkeepers and shake down politicians. A gang might offer its services to a Tammany Hall candidate to strong-arm voters, and in exchange, expect protection or payoffs once that politician was in office. This era saw gangsters and politicians in a mutually beneficial dance. Corruption in the police force was also a huge problem. Gangs often operated with impunity because they bribed police captains or had them in their pocket via political connections. However, the Whyos eventually fell as spectacularly as they had risen. In 1884, a turning point came when one of the gang's ringleaders, Danny Driscoll, was arrested and executed for murder. He was charged with killing a woman in a dispute over a third wheel, another girlfriend, a highly publicized case. Never really ends well, doesn't it? Well, Driscoll's hanging effectively decapitated the gang's leadership. Public outrage at the Whyos' excesses gave the reform-minded police an opening to clamp down, and many Whyos were rounded up and sent to prison in the aftermath. and the gang, as an organized entity, effectively fragmented away. The New York journalist of the time, a New York journalist at the time rather, noted that famous gangs tended to pass away after their leaders were removed, only to be reborn in new form, kind of like a cardboard box in the rain, I suppose, withering away. And this was precisely what happened. The end of the Whyos was not the end of gangs, because younger criminals soon regrouped under new banners, then just picked up where the Whyos left off. Indeed, by the late 1880s and early 1890s, you could list dozens of gang names that prowled the New York slums. Some were based in specific wards or along certain avenues. For instance, there were the Rock Gang, the Rag Gang, the Stable Gang, and the Short Tail Gang down by the docks, to name just a few that achieved bad eminence, as reformer Jacob Riis wrote. None of them very intimidating names, though. I think Dead Rabbits certainly takes the most intimidating name. Well, in the city's west side, an area called Hell's Kitchen, around 10th Avenue in the 40s, became known for its tough Irish gangs. Even a crew simply known as the Hell's Kitchen Gang made headlines by committing acts like blowing up a storefront that displeased them. The city's East River waterfront had river pirates, as they were called. One gang called the Daybreak Boys, a gang of teenage boat thieves in the 1850s who would row out before dawn and rob ships at anchor. Yeah, that's piracy, all right. Right in the middle of the city. That's just crazy, absolutely crazy. Well, the Daybreak Boys were said to require any new member to have committed at least one murder as initiation, and they supposedly killed dozens of ship watchmen during their reign. There were also the Slaughterhouse Gang, the Hook Gang, specializing in dock thefts, and others operating in every dark little corner of Manhattan. Well, if the gangs fought each other less openly in huge street battles after the 1860s, they still fought someone on a nightly basis, and that was often the police. Jacob Riis wrote in 1890 that every corner has its gang, and he added that the police of the period liked to pretend organized gangs didn't exist, even while nursing the bruises from the nightly battles with them. These gangs preyed on the unwary. A drunk stumbling home through the wrong block could likely be surrounded, beaten, and robbed. Many a corpse was later fished out of the river after such incidents. The gangs also loved a good free-for-all brawl. Neighborhood rivalries or ethnic tensions could spark small gang wars. For example, the Irish gangs versus the newly arrived Italian gangs in some quarters, or Catholics versus Protestants. The 1870s saw the Orange Riots, when Irish Catholic and Irish Protestant factions, not exactly street gangs but similar crowds, bloodily clashed during parades. But through all this, the public became gradually less tolerant of gang violence. At the start, it was one of those things where it was, oh, it's just a fact of life, it's just the way it is. But after a while, it was just too much. People did not want it to be just one of those things anymore. Community vigilante actions were not unheard of. One famous anecdote: a town up the Hudson River, tired of hosting the moonlight picnics of New York gangsters, that is, raucous, drunken outings where city gangs took a ferry up to party and terrorize locals, finally took matters into their own hands. When a boatload of these gang members arrived one summer day, the local citizens planted a howitzer cannon on the dock and aimed it at the disembarking gang, warning them to turn back or, well, they would open fire. Faced with an entire town literally armed to the teeth, the shocked gang picnickers slunk back onto their boat and left peacefully. I can imagine them walking backwards slowly, facing their palms towards the town. Okay, okay. Where did they get the howitzer cannon from, though? That's a bit of a gap in the story. I'm not sure. Americans always having the guns on hand. For better or worse, who knows? But this time it certainly worked out well, the right to self-defense. Stories like this, reported by crusading journalists like Rees, show both the brazenness of the gangs, but also the lengths to which normal, decent, hard-working people were willing to go to now to reclaim their streets. Well, those are the big stories. But what was daily life like for the 19th century gang members? Well, to paint a picture of that, we should probably understand the social conditions that produced such gangs and sustained them. Most, of course, were born out of desperate poverty. The slums were not the nicest place to grow up in. The gang members were typically young men, sometimes teenage boys, who grew up in those teeming slums, places where overcrowding, unemployment, and crime were constants. Many were the children of immigrants, and they often faced discrimination and limited opportunities. The gangs, in a sense, provided a rough brotherhood, and a way to earn a living, albeit a criminal one, when all the legitimate paths were closed off or just too difficult. 5 Points, for example, was described in the mid-1800s as the world's most notorious slum. In one single block, dozens of tenements housed with thousands of people in filthy, airless rooms. Saloons, dance halls, brothels, gambling dens. Every corner had at least one of them. Within this environment, gangs formed almost as neighborhood clubs. A young boy might start running with a local clique of other poor kids, perhaps stealing food or picking pockets. And this could evolve into a named gang with its own turf. You gotta start somewhere. But there was even a term for juvenile groups that roamed with beer pails. Growler gangs. Named for the growler, that is a metal pail used to fetch beer for a saloon. These were like the junior varsity of the criminal world. Teenagers gathering to drink, boast, commit petty thefts, some of whom would graduate to the big league gangs like that of the Whyos or 5 Points gang in time. Now, I don't know about your country, but this certainly sounds like what's going on in Australia at the moment. Teenagers. Anyway, history repeats itself, I suppose. The gangs often had their headquarters in a particular saloon or tavern, which served as a clubhouse and a sanctuary. For the 40 thieves, it was Rosanna Pierre's back room. For the Whyos and others, it might be a dive on the Bowery or in Chinatown. These hangouts were where plans were made. It was whether it was a burglary, an election day scheme, or a showdown with rivals, the saloon owners were frequently in on the action, fencing stolen goods or paying gangs to drive away troublemakers that threatened their business. Gang culture celebrated toughness and defiance. The members styled themselves as kind of Robin Hood-like heroes of the slums, even protectors of their neighborhood against outsiders or the hated police. They had their own slang, their own codes, their own rules. Many prided themselves on quirky trademarks. One gang leader might always wear a flashy suit. Another might be known for a specific weapon. We've already heard about Hellcat Maggie sharpening her teeth, and Dandy Johnny's shoe blades. There were also Gallus Mag, a female bouncer at the 5 Points Tavern, reputed for physically biting off the ears of troublemakers. He supposedly kept a collection of these years in a jar, an example of how these stories blur the line between truth and myth. But, well, it wouldn't surprise me too much. Everyone has to have a hobby, right? You've got to collect something. Well, women were not usually formal gang members, but a few women in this era gained fearsome reputations alongside the men. Most women in gang environments were either companions of the gangsters or ran establishments that the gangs frequented. But clearly, figures like Hellcat Maggie show that a particularly fierce woman could fight alongside the men and earn her own place in the gang lore. The typical crimes of street gangs ran the gamut from petty to heinous. Pickpocketing and a little bit of sneak thievery were common. A gang might deploy some members as skilled pickpockets, working crowded markets or docks, and then pull the loot at a day's end. Burglary was another staple. Plenty of jobs available. Thinking of Delvin Mallory from Skyrim. Many gang members were adept at house breaking or shop breaking, especially in an era before alarms and electric lighting. Admittedly, quite a bit easier back then. Gangs also engaged in highway robbery on city streets, the classic scenario of a pack of tough guys surrounding a lone pedestrian on a dark street and robbing him at knife or gunpoint. A drunk person was an easy target. Part of the gang strategy was to lurk near bars late at night looking for intoxicated marks. Violence for hire was another service that gangs offered. For example, if a local business refused to pay protection money, the gang might vandalize the shop or assault the owner. If a politician needed some muscle to discourage the opposition's voters, gangs could supply that as well. And as we mentioned, certain gangs practically put up a price list on mayhem. It was an era without formal organized crime families as we later know them, but the street gangs were effectively proto-organizations dabbling in racketeering. And for all their bravado, not all gang members lived long. Many died young, or spent their lives in prison, which a prison in the 1800s, well, you may as well just take the early checkout line rather than living a life in there. The ones who did survive tended to be those who either used the gang as a springboard to something else like politics or being a saloon keeper, or those who were savvy enough to avoid taking the fall when the law closed in. Police work was improving by the 80s and 90s too. Detectives like Thomas Burns, famed NYPD chief detective in the 1880s, pioneered methods of profiling criminals, photographing and compiling rogues galleries as they were called, and also coordinating manhunts. Burns published a book in 1886 listing hundreds of known criminals, including many gang figures of course, suggesting that by then the police were building an institutional memory of who these gangsters were. Still, day-to-day reality in gang-infested neighborhoods meant that ordinary citizens often felt unprotected. Many residents just endured the situation, while a few might quietly collaborate with gangs for survival. Shopkeepers would pay the, quote, voluntary contributions when gangs passed the hat to avoid destruction of their storefronts, and when a gang member was finally arrested and hauled off to serve a prison stretch, he could expect a hero's welcome from his comrades upon release, a kind of badge of honor. Reese remarked that by the time a toughened gang member had gone to jail a few times, he was practically beyond saving. No employer would have him. He couldn't even work down at the docks. They wouldn't even let him lift things. He would just simply sink back into the underworld permanently until he went back to jail or got killed. By the 1890s, New York's street gang culture was undergoing another evolution, driven largely by new waves of immigration and the city's continual expansion. The descendants of the Irish Five Pointers and the native Bowery Boys were still around. But now you had Italian and Jewish immigrant gangs forming on the Lower East Side, and some of the old Irish gangs were moving uptown or to other boroughs. The last years of the 19th century saw the rise of gangs that would directly bridge the gap into the era of organized crime in the 20th century. Topic for another video, of course. One key figure was Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, also known as Paul Kelly. He took an Irish-sounding alias to fit in. Paul Kelly was an Italian immigrant who in the 1890s formed the 5 Points Gang, recruiting many Italians and Irish youths from the old 5 Points neighborhood and beyond. The 5 Points Gang under Paul Kelly became one of the most dominant street gangs as the century turned. Kelly was shrewd and modeled his gang almost like a business. He recruited a small army, by some estimates 1,500 members, and set up headquarters at the New Brighton Dance Hall on Great Jones Street. So from there, the 5 Points Gang ran vice rings, gambling rackets, and extortion schemes, and provided muscle for Tammany Hall politicians. They weren't shy about using deadly violence to maintain control. Rising to challenge them was another huge gang, led by a Jewish tough named Monk Eastman. Monk Eastman's gang, based in the Lower East Side's Jewish enclaves, was equally formidable with around 1,200 members. Between the 5 Points Gang and the Eastman Gang, New York had two criminal armies who effectively controlled large swaths of Manhattan by the late 1890s. Their rivalry erupted into what some have called New York's first real gangland war, including a legendary gun battle under the elevated train tracks of 2nd Avenue around 1903, where scores of gangsters from each side exchanged gunfire in a pitched fight that amazed even the hardened police. Well, these late-century gangsters like Kelly and Eastman represent a kind of transition. Unlike the old street gangs that primarily use fists, clubs, knives, the new gangs were heavily armed with revolvers. Gunplay became more common, and the objectives of conflicts were more about controlling profitable criminal enterprise, like gambling territories, brothel districts, this kind of thing. They'd kind of moved away from honor fights and brawling for brawling's sake that characterized the earlier gang rumbles. Now they had more practical concerns. In a sense, the era of that purely territorial street gang was giving way to the era of the organized crime syndicate. It's telling that the members of Paul Kelly's 5 Points Gang in the early 1900s would include future notorious mobsters, a young Al Capone, for instance, first learning the ropes of gang life as a low-level member of the 5 Points Gang before moving on to Chicago. Likewise, Lucky Luciano and Johnny Torrio were the 5 Points Gang alumni too. In other words, the street gangs of 19th century New York were the direct ancestors of the American mafia and organized gangs of the 20th century. But we're going to stick in the 1800s, okay? We're almost finished anyway. We can't go on and on about a completely different topic. In any case, as the 1800s closed, law enforcement was catching up too. The turn of the century saw reformers like Theodore Roosevelt, who served as the president of the police commission in the 1890s, attempt to clean up police corruption and take a harder line on crime. Monk Eastman, for instance, was eventually betrayed by Tammany Hall and prosecuted. He did a stint in prison which effectively broke his gang apart. Paul Kelly survived longer, aligning cleverly with political powers, but even his influence waned as New York modernized and cracked down following the volatile 1900 to 1905 period of gang warfare. So the story of New York's 19th century street gangs is, in the end, kind of a tale of a big city's growing pains. When you build civilization, you get cockroaches. Oh, I wouldn't be saying that to any of the gang's faces, though. Well, these gangs sprang up from the horrific urban conditions: overcrowding, poverty, discrimination. Far from the vacuum of effective law enforcement, the slums. And that brings the question, is life hard because there is gangs? Or are there gangs because life is so hard? Which came first? To me, it seems pretty obvious that it's just, it grows out of that socioeconomic condition. If people feel that there's no hope for the future, well then, they don't really follow the rules that society sets for them. In any case, the gangs provided a twisted form of order and identity for those who joined them, even as they terrorized others. Over the century, gangs went from ragtag collections of pickpockets meeting in a corner grog shop to large proto-mafia organizations with hundreds of members, and in fighting them, New York had to modernize its police force and eventually confront the deep social issues. Yet beyond the sociological analysis, the gangs left us with enduring legends and quite colorful characters. They've been romanticized in books and films, most famously in depiction in the mid-century gangs of New York. Well, while popular culture often takes liberties, of course, the realities are dramatic enough. Who needs fiction when in real life you've got gang leaders taking on names like the Butcher and Monk, carrying everything from butcher knives to pistols, engaging in street battles that literally required calling the National Guard in? Who needs embellishment when a man like Bill the Butcher could become a folk hero simply for being viciously anti-immigrant, or when a fighter like Hellcat Maggie could scare grown men with her dental work and brass claws? Well, listening to this story, maybe you're struck by how some of the themes resonate even today. Issues of street violence, youth gangs, turf wars, and the nexus of crime in politics. They didn't vanish as soon as the gas lights came on, and the electricity came in, and the internet and the smartphones. We still got these problems. They're a little bit different now. Of course, we don't have, well, it depends when you're watching. I don't know how bad things are going to get over the next few years. Let's hope that things change. In any case, we're not going to go into modern politics and social issues, aren't we? What we are going to go into is my list of top-tier patrons, because that is the end of our video for today, and I'd like to thank them for keeping everything ad-free for you. So we got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carey, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulvanir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftas, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, and Are You My Mum? That's not a question, that is the name of the patron. And that is it from me for today. What an interesting topic. I hope you enjoyed it. Perhaps you feel like going and watching the film Gangs of New York now. Don't get on my case if things are not historically accurate or that sort of thing. Enjoy it for what it is. Don't expect a Hollywood film to be 100% perfect on everything. It's made for entertainment. If you want something accurate, you go and read a book or a peer-reviewed journal, something like that. In any case, lots of love to you all. I will see you when you feel inclined to return. Good night, and farewell for now.